we walk by this house all the time, and we always think of it because there's buoys hanging off the side. Is that correct? Buoys, 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 buoys.
Where's he from, Kansas?
It's the house with the buoys. Anyhow, you've walked by it a million times, but this is how it looks now. And let's go to the first slide.
Is that the cornerstone for the Stingy Alley?
That is, yeah, that's there.
Go back and point that out, please, we can mark it.
Right there. And there's one on the other end too. And
Doug, one more question. Why did they call it Stingy Alley?
well, when they built the church, I think 1835, they put aside a strip of land to the. Okay. When they built the church, I think they put aside a strip of land for people who couldn't afford to pay for seats in the church, because you had to buy your pews at that point in time. So the story, as I knew it, meant that it was kind of like the cheap seats outside the church.
And that's right on the side of her house.
Yes, she happens to be on the west side of that. Yes. And one thing also to notice when we talk about this a little bit, the house next door, they were in the same family for generations together. So just to kind of be aware of that, but we'll get to that in a second. But first slide. Okay, the earliest deed I can find in this house is a transaction between James Goff selling the land to a John Salisbury. This is late November 1795. There's no mention of any dwelling house, so I think it's literally just raw land. There's no later deed for this house till later in the 1800s. So I'm pretty, and this house was in the same family for 3 generations as well. So I'm thinking this is the absolute original transaction. There is one from 1832, but it's a mortgage discharge document, so it had no real bearing on when houses being built. So I think it's John and his wife was Abigail Salisbury. They bought this land 1795. When David and I first went to the house to look at it, because we'd like to compare the research to the physical evidence as well, and just walking right in the front door, David immediately went, "Oh, this is the old one," because it's post and beam construction, and the current layout in the main room to the left, it has exposed beams which are hand cut, and immediately dated it as a very early house. We go to the next slide though. When we got okay. Okay, that the deed I showed was from book 4, page 44. The interesting thing is the initial owner, John Salisbury, died 3 years later after inheriting the land, but his wife and children continued to live there. She didn't die till 1848, and then their son probably built the second house I pointed out in the initial slide, and he died in 1850. But when we get to the next slide, down in the basement of the house had been, it's a really old basement, and one thing that confused us, which we can't really explain, is in the center of the house, there's one beam, and it's got this date on it, which is July 16, 1833. So in trying to, figure this all out, our only explanation is that at some point in the 1830s that the house was upgraded somehow. The 1851 map shows that both houses were much smaller in their original state than they eventually ended up, but it's just kind of one of those anomalies. It's kind of tough to explain, but it's there, and it's hard to explain. But the upstairs definitely kind of predated that, because I think you were saying that post and beam was kind of on the way out by the time by this date. So next slide. This is the 1851 map. As we know, by 1851, actually the first two John Salisburys were both gone at that point. But it shows a two house setup here in 1851, and they're both kind of slight in size. The current house abuts Stingy Alley right here, and there's a definite space there, and the house there is it's much slighter than what stands now. Next slide. Okay, so the second John Salisbury, his wife Betsy didn't die till 1871 at age 79. And I think we'll see in the 1870 map, which is coming up, that it shows as S. Salisbury Estate, but there is no S. Salisbury. I think that's just a misreading of J from the manuscript. And I think in the next map, 1855, both houses have been expanded to the initial house to the east. So the next slide is, here's the 1870 map, and where are we? Yeah, here's Stingy Alley here, and we can see the house is expanded to the east here, so it now abuts Stingy Alley, and there's been an addition added to the house to the west. So there were definite things going on between 1851 and 1870. And next, okay. So then there was the John Salisbury III, and he inherited the two houses. He was the oldest son. He had a younger brother, Levi. He sold to Levi after their mother died in 1875. The same year, Levi turns around and sells the house to Lewis Horde that same year. It should be Hoare. Sorry, no D there. And then the heirs of Lewis Hoare, they sell the house to a Henry S. Birch, 1886. In all cases, it's the two houses. The estate of Henry Birch sells the two houses to a Michelle Mangino in 1929, who in turn sells to a John and Laura Locke. And their son, John D. and Elaine Locke, in 1995, they separate the two properties and sell the house in question at 31 Church Street to the current owner. It was Susan and Leonard bought it originally. Leonard has since passed, so it's now entirely in Susan's name. And she is the current owner. But we get to the next picture after this. This is just the succession from Birch to Anderson. The next picture David found here's the headstones for two of the John Salisbury. They're in the north burial ground in Warren towards the back. Shows the... What's that? What was that?
They invented the Salisbury steak.
They invented the Salisbury steak. Anyhow, there's two generations of Salisbury. But the exciting part is the next picture after this. It was originally a half cottage posted beam original structure, widely expanded and raised to the current Greek Revival manner. Here's 1929. So here's the house. So I thought I'd keep that as the last picture, just to show how old that house is. At one point I was trying to determine which was older, but I believe this to be the original house, and this was built in the second generation. But the house has been raised, it's been expanded, there's been expanded out the back porch, so that the Lodge family who owned it immediately after this photo for like 60 years, they totally kind of butchered the house, because it really looks nothing like that now. The chimney was removed. So if you look at the house today, you don't get the sense it's that old, but it really is. So David found this picture for us, so it was a nice addition. So that's 31 Church Street. So now we're on Main Street. We all know this house. It was renovated 5 or 6 years ago, quite seriously. And it's, I struggled with this house a little bit because David and I went and looked at it very early on just to get a sense of its age. And at that point, I had 2 different deeds, one which kind of placed it in the 1840s and another one that would have placed it in the middle 1860s. But I was able to resolve that. So if we go to the first slide, this deed goes back to 1800, and you can't read it, but on this land, it describes a brick dwelling house back in 1800. So we know it's not the original structure that's there now, but it was a comfort barn he sold to James Stevens. If we go to the next slide, original brick structures mentioned in the deed, Book 4, page 64. And this land was previously sold to Stevens by Level Maxwell, who I believe owns the brick house across the street. So he seemed to be a landowner in the area. And where it gets interesting is in 1848, Stevens sells to George Butts. So we have George Butts living in the brick house. His daughter, Betsy, married a sea captain, William Martin. She purchased the land immediately to the south, abutting Liberty Street, and they build their own house. So it's a father-daughter pair of houses. George Butt, the father, dies in 1850, and his wife Avis dies in 1851. And the 2 houses are shown in the 1851 map, and again in 1855. If we go to the next slide, we'll see here, this is the brick house. It's on the site of the current house, and this is where the daughter lived with Captain William Martin. And if we get to that, I think we show the 1855 map next. Yeah. So we have the same properties here. There's the brick house, and then there's the Martin house. If we go again, here's 18. I just threw this in, but this shows William and Betsy Martin living on Main Street. There doesn't seem to be anyone living in the brick house at this point because the neighbor is an additional house north there. So the next map, we go, no. 1860, we only see the Martins. The parents' house seems unoccupied. 1862 map, the house is still there as the James Butts estate. But in 1866, Betsy Martin, William had died at sea, sells the abandoned brick house to Charles C. Handy, and she moves her own house from the corner property down on Liberty Street, and I can show you that. The next map, this is 1862, so it didn't change there. Brick house is there, Martin's there. We go to the next map, and we have deed Betsy Martin to Charles Handy, 1866. Next map, here's 1870. So we see Handy is now built on the site of the old brick house, and the William Martin house actually has just moved right here. Mrs. William B. Martin.
A brick house, they moved?
No, the brick house got torn down and this was constructed, and the house on the corner moved down here. So what I was able to figure was that the deed I had in 1866 selling the single property, the single dwelling on that property to Charles H. Handy, he built the house at that point. And it actually, the house has kind of moved a little bit. He's sliced this off to the north. The brick house used to just kind of be about here. So he built just a little bit to the south. And the current layout is, again, there is now this property was again divided later, and there's now a house on the corner. But all these houses moved around in the 1800s. So we were able to confirm that it was Handy who built the house, the current house.
Doug, I get a question.
Yes.
Is that a rope walk I see?
Yeah, the rope walk's Union Street. So that's Union Street right there. That feeds right into Carey's driveway.
Yeah.
I think, huh? Yeah, Warren Ave, sorry. Yeah, Union's the next one. That's Union, that's Warren Ave.
So can you explain a little bit about what a rope walk is?
Well, it's for the shipping industry. That's how they wove the rope. But they needed the length of a street to do it. The process was just twisting yarns of I don't know, what is it, hemp?
Did they use horses to make it tight?
I'm not sure about that. Do you have any rope walk experts?
Mervyn?
They use people, they use kids.
Oh, kids, yeah.
Kids?
Okay.
Rope walk kids?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so next slide. So Handy sells in 1904 to Charles Abbott, who divided the property and enlarged it. Abbott House is subsequently sold repeatedly, and then in 2010, developer buys the rundown house, making major renovations, tearing down the garage, but chooses not to stay, and in 2012 sold to its current owners, Gary Reno and Joseph Bernardo, who continue with improvements to this day. I think that's that. Oh, here's the Charles Abbott plat map at Town Hall. You can see the house is existing there. There's the garage, which is torn down. He's subdivided the land, so this is where the current house has been added in this century. I just thought I'd throw that in as a visual. And what do we have next? Next. And this is just showing ownership from the plat, the Abbott plat. It's been bought and sold 1 million times. And I believe when the developer bought it in 2011 that the house was in pretty rough shape. So he did a considerable upgrade at that point. We're next. And now we're on my third property. This is Taylor Box Company. Taylor Box Company. There's not a lot of research on this because it's pretty straightforward. If we go to the next, this is the earliest deed I could find. It's in 1909, and it's describing Child Street, the transfer of this land. And the only mention of a building is a barn. So I think it was subdivided off of someone's farm. But I believe in the transaction that from a private citizen to a manufacturing company, that's when the original commercial building was built. So if we go to the next slide, 1909, Charles Bliss sells to Rhode Island Distributing. They sell to Rudolph Haffenreffer. I don't know if he was financing it. Haffenreffer sells to the French manufacturing company. French manufacturing company sells to Medicom Spinning. This is in the height of the mill era for textile productions. After 1921, a series of commercial ownerships culminating with Box Taylor Company purchasing the property in 1983, and which continues to this day. So I think that's that for that property.
I have a little more for you then.
Okay.
So I own the property.
Okay.
There's a brick building on the corner that I think that was this is what I understand from the folks that have,
Been around
forever.
Yeah.
That the corner brick building was the local brewery, and that I think that was, Haffenreffer or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's a brick building. If you go inside the building, you'll see that there are exterior windows and everything, and it's very much a standalone building. My grandfather bought it in 1952 when it was owned by the Bates Silk Mill.
Yeah. Okay.
So the date of purchase, 83,
Yeah.
was when we actually changed the ownership
Yeah.
and the family. So
So your family's actually owned it since the early 50s.
52.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
52.
Yeah.
And they moved down from Eagle Street in Providence because my grandfather bought some farm property in Barrington on Rumstick Point, and he didn't like the commute. So that's how they thought in those days. But
Okay.
he had lived in Edgewood, and after the Second World War decided he wanted to move to the country, so he came to the East Bay and bought the land over in Barrington, and didn't want to drive into Providence, so they bought the Bates Silk Mill.
Okay.
And when I was a little kid, there was a horse barn attached to the backside of the building. The building...
That could even be the barn that's mentioned in 1909.
It could be. But what's interesting is if you go inside the building, it's got everything that an old New England manufacturing firm should have. You visited. It's got a big walk-in vault with a vault door that's about a foot thick. And I always wondered, those silk guys, really, they needed a vault like that?
Yeah.
But what you notice is the brick building was first. Then the folks that built the first structure, which I think is that 1921 maybe, back in that time.
Yeah.
But you look in the ceiling and you can still see the spools that are still screwed into the ceiling of the building. And you walk halfway down the building, and the first half of the building is built with the most beautiful, heavy-duty lumber. And we've made some changes and taken some poles out or whatever. And when you look at the lumber, the inside, looking at the sawed half of it, this is old growth, beautiful, beautiful timbers with, like, I really need to stop and count the rings, but it's the old, absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous wood.
Yeah.
And you walk halfway down the mill, which of course the first half is all post and beam, but you walk halfway down the mill, and suddenly it goes to a center lolly column, steel lolly column, and they go from post and beam to steel I-beams.
Wow.
So as I understand it, again, the addition was put on after the First World War, when the country had built its steel industry to a point that it was supplanting the wood industry, and wood was set aside and no longer built with, and they went to I-beams. So it's kind of fun to walk through the building
Yeah.
and see sort of architectural history. It's got the brick building on the corner, and then it's got the old post and beam, and then in the back it's got the I-beams, and then it's got the typical down and dirty slab buildings attached to it. I apologize, but we have small boxes. So anyway, there's a little bit.
Okay, well, thank you. That's all good information. Thank you. I think you're next. A good history of businesses in there.
Taylor.
What's that?
Taylor was this guy, Clarence Taylor, who started the Taylor Box and Card Shop in Providence on West Exchange Street. And they made hat boxes and retail boxes. It was founded in 1885. We have pictures of, and it used to be called the Taylor Box and Card Company because they made cards and they made boxes. It was all, pretty much made by hand. And we have a picture of the Taylor Box and Card delivery vehicle, which was a horse-drawn carriage with a sign on the side of it. And my grandfather, after World War II, came up here and fell in love with this girl from, like Love Story, but no death. And married this girl from Edgewood, and took his grub stake and bought this little 6-employee company that had been started in 1885, and he bought it, I think, in 1921, and operated it there, and then moved it. And their original location is somewhere in the middle of the Civic Center. And then he moved to Eagle Street by the U.S. Rubber mills down there on Eagle Street. And then, like I said, he got tired of the city life over there in Edgewood and decided to move down here to the country.
The country. Remember that, folks. I'm going to hand it over to David now.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Yeah. This is a very interesting house. It's a very nice Greek Revival cottage, circa 1840, and I'll explain a little bit.
Just push the red.
It is the oldest house in the general area, a little bit outside of town toward the east, and it was obviously the anchor farmhouse for the whole Laurel Hill area. This was a little bit of a difficult house to research because it has some very unusual problems with the documentation of the deeds. For some reason, all the deeds in the mid-19th century, while they are properly referenced and cross-referenced in the deed index, the actual deeds themselves are all missing. I've never seen anything like this in all the research I've done. We had the town clerk get in on it, and we thought that there was perhaps a secondary book in the basement. We searched the archives in the basement, but there's no sign of 50 pages which cover the entire early history of the house, and I can't explain it. However, fortunately, I was able to find it on some early maps, and so we do have some corroborating evidence. And it was built basically either between 1840 and 1845. The exact date, because of this deed situation, is impossible to determine right now. I feel comfortable with a circa 1840 date. It might be a few years newer, but close enough, I think, for what we're doing here. And it's a perfectly good example of a house that would have been built between 1840 and 1845. Based on the standard evolving style of Greek Revival. It has, you can see, Greek Revival trim. The siding is all fitting. The chimney, I have not seen the inside of the house. The chimney does not look to be original, but it was probably an addition during the conversion from fireplace to stove, which happened usually somewhere in the 1870s. Next slide, please. Here we have a list of deed references, so that if the owner or anyone else would like to take a look at some of the documentation, sadly, as I mentioned, some of it does not really exist. But Walter Barker owned quite a bit of land and a farmstead in the area during the 1840s and 1850s, and sold the land in 1871 to George Monroe. Monroe sold it shortly after to Emily Moon, and there was a mortgage recorded from Leonard Monroe to Warren Moon, Emily's husband. Shortly thereafter, in 1882, the estate of Emily sold to Rebecca Thomas this lot with the dwelling. Rebecca Thomas sold it to John Thomas later. Finally, in 1947, it went to changed families to Russell and Marietta Bullock. Then it was sold to Walter and Marietta Hufftalin, and then to Jared and Paulina Kelly, the current owners. You'll notice that I have another anomaly to the documentation of this house, which seems to be cursed in Town Hall. The card lists a 2018 deed transfer to Karen Padrick, which is obviously erroneous. And in fact, I will be speaking to the town clerk about that to try to clarify that. So there we have 11 Laurel. 14 Linden Street is another very, very interesting house. In fact, this house was remarkable enough that the researcher for the 2002 National Register application for the Warren waterfront made a specific note, which was very unusual, in fact it was unique in that survey, that this was a very interesting house that needed further investigation. Because it's not very clear what's going on here from looking at it. It looks like an old house, and yet it's actually clearly a Dutch colonial revival, a rare style in New England. It's common in the mid-Atlantic states. And I have decided to name this the Bowen Luther House for a couple of reasons. First of all, it replaced a house that was a very early Warren house built in about 1770. It was part of the original Josias Linden plat of 1765, and it was sold to, several lots were sold to Samuel Fisk, then also to Nathan Bowen. Bowen accumulated the two lots, one where the house is and one where the garage is right now, and built his house in the late 1760s or around 1770. It remained with his family all the way until 1904. It had changed hands several times, and changed names to Luther, because his daughter married a Luther, and his granddaughter had another name, Susan Flint. But it was all the same family, all the way from 1770 to 1904, when it was sold to John West. This house was built approximately in 1880. We know that because it does not appear on maps in the early 70s, and it does appear in the maps in the mid-80s. Also, the second clue is, since it is definitely a colonial revival style, the colonial style itself was really not introduced until the Centennial Exhibition in 1876. And so it would have not, a house like this would not have been built before 1778 or 9. I'm sorry, 1888 or 9. So I believe this house was built approximately 1880. And that's within a few years, given its appearance on the different maps. This is an interesting case where it showed up on not the regular maps that we normally use, but a Sanborn fire insurance map, which is issued a little more regularly and in some great detail. So, to summarize this was a house, originally on this site, was a house, probably another gambrel, a smaller gambrel, very similar to the house around the corner on 23 Broad Street, which is usually known as the Nicholas Campbell House, built about the same time. And they kept the same gambrel style, rotated it 90 degrees and made a new, larger house, and then extended the back shortly after it was built. By 1890s, it was in its present form. And it has really changed probably very little since then, except for the replacement windows. The windows were upgraded sometime around 1900.
Dave, is that roof, that flare?
Yeah, that's what's the characteristic. There were actually, in this case, there were two characteristics of the Dutch colonial revival. One of them being the kick out, the curved kick out at the bottom of the lower gambrel. But the dead giveaway is the gambrel dormer. That is never seen in any New England style. And in fact, it's not even seen on actual Dutch colonial houses. It is strictly a Dutch colonial revival feature. So it makes it really unmistakable, what the intent of the builder was here, I believe. Okay, I think that's. Any questions on that?
Is it a two-family or?
Now it's a two-family. There was an apartment added to the back, or the eastern side of the back on the second floor. Right now, in fact, the owner's nephew lives on the main part of the house in front, and the owner's father and stepmother live in the apartment in the back.
David, the corner house, the William Hoare house, the Carey's house, they have that garage in the back that has
Yes.
the same architecture.
Yes.
Was that part of that?
No, it was built probably at the same time, though,
Yeah.
around 1890.
Yeah.
Around 1890, that colonial revival style really took off. This house, in fact, if it weren't for the fact that it's on a map much earlier, I would actually guess that this house was probably 1890-ish, because that was the style that was popular at that time. This was a little bit advanced in taste, apparently, by a decade or so. This is the house just two doors down, 24 Linden Street. This is a nice old 1929 photo. It's not of the house in question, but it does give us a nice firm date, because this is the corner of the porch of 24 Linden Street. Oh, I'm sorry. Right here you can see the porch, corner of the porch of 24 Linden Street, in this 1929 photograph of 20 Linden Street, Dory Skemp's house. Now, this is interesting because the house was actually, until the late 30s, basically on the same property. There were no separate deeds or records of the house. However, it's a case of looking at the insurance maps, when it appeared, when it was not there, and when it was there. So we can pin it down to just a few years. And with an additional clue, which was that Dory's house, that is 20 Linden Street, was sold in 1921 to Elizabeth Mason sold it to George and Mary Patton. And they built the house a couple of years later. For what reason, it's unknown. Since they lived in the main big house, it's possible it was for an in-law type arrangement. It could have just been for income. Right now, that is not really known. That decade is not, history of the house is not very well known. However, it does appear by the end of the decade. I think 1924 has been historically associated with the house by local lore, and everything about it fits that. So I feel comfortable with going a circa 1924 date on it. It's definitely within a year of that. It's interesting that basically it remained. Yes, right. It's a really nice craftsman colonial, typical of the 20s. There has been local lore that this was a Sears kit house, but after looking at the Sears Kit House archives and on the Sears website, it does not match any of the known designs that were available in the 1920s. It's possible that it was another kind of kit house because a Sears kit during the 30s became kind of synonymous with like a Kleenex brand name, and so every kit house was a Sears kit house. It could have been an Aladdin kit house, or it also could have been put together from kit parts, because at that time, local lumber yards sold prefab sections of houses that you could just get delivered on a truck. For example, that you could order a porch of this variety, and the whole porch would come all cut and ready to nail together. So it's very possible that it was something like that. I've been talking to the owner, Greg, about doing some little more research. He's taken a couple of shots at looking for timber markings, which would be the giveaway of being a kit house. We have not had any luck in that area yet, but I find this house interesting, so I'm going to keep looking until we can pin that down, or not, one way or the other. Anyway, the bank took the entire property through a mortgage default in 1937, and in 1939, the Industrial Trust Company split the land up and sold both houses as separate lots, and which is why now the current lot is not in order. So lot 41 is the house, the big house next door, and this became lot 120. In 1951, it was sold to William and James Nolan, and then in 92 to Sam Blando and Candace Dixon, who recently sold it to Greg and Deborah, who are the current owners. That was in 2017. This is another house that has some of the same characteristics research-wise, in that it was built on mill property, so there was no deed associated with a specific house. It was just one of 20 or so houses in the neighborhood that were built on the mill property. And at that time, we don't even have permits available to pin that down any further. Fortunately, in this case, we can nail it down to a single 2-year period because of its appearance and non-appearance on 2 fire insurance maps in 1895 and 1898. So we know that it was built either in 1896, which is the date that I've assigned, or possibly in 1897. Definitely one of those 2 years, no question about it. It's one of the later style mill houses that was done at the time, kind of a popular colonial revival style, big boxy side gable, a little bit reminiscent of the Georgian proportions, but simplified. It had simple trim, although I've been inside it, it's actually pleasant enough to be. What's actually spectacular about it, though, are the views. It is right on the water. From the second floor in the back, there's an unobstructed view of Barrington, the marina, the harbor, the whole river all the way down. This is really an amazing sight. Sadly, you pay for that here by the fact that this has been seriously flooded at least 3 times. Quite a bit of evidence in the basement of timber damage, and which makes sense because it's only about 8 feet above sea level. I believe it was 6 feet under, literally, during the 38 hurricane. And it's been flooded in 54, and sometime even more recently than that, too. The current owners are actually seeking some permission to raise the house to current code requirements, which I think requires raising it like 8 feet from above from where it is. I don't know how that's going over with the permitting process, but we'll see. It's a shame to see the house flooded, although, of course, raising it radically like that also changes its historic context and style. So it's a quandary.
Might want to point out that the original mill burned in 1895, I think.
Oh, right.
So
That's
this was
right.
built-
So this is part of the rebuilding.
Right.
And in fact, this is, in a newer style, since a lot of the older styles were built on a side-by-side cross gable with You know, they were more horizontally oriented, mostly 1.5 story. And this is a full 2-story. Good point.
So we can assume that the factory fire came out of the north and
Yes, now this is pretty far down, right, in fact, it's right at the edge, at the southern edge of the mill
so
property.
is this on Company Street?
This is theoretically, of course, the address is 24 Westminster, but it is actually on Company Street. Westminster Street is an interesting street that was originally the main street that went right in front of the mill front door, and went all the way up to where the pump station is, or whatever you call that building that now the National Grid has. And it went from there all the way down to Company Street. Actually, a block past Company Street. Johnson Street. But it was changed numerous times. And now all it is sort of a stub. There are 2 stubs of it that aren't even at the same, in the same line. But they're both, and so some number of the addresses, like this house, don't make sense anymore.
It should be Company Street.
It should be Company Street, really, but historically it was originally, when it was built, Westminster Street ran right in front of it.
I get you.
And so the address remained.
Thank you for that insight.
Yeah, okay, so here we have just a brief summary. It's a very, very, very simple history because it was part of the mill for so long. And finally, basically in 1934, when the mill was basically dissolving, it was sold to Frank and Carolina Matchgut, and then it was sold to a whole bunch more people who mostly only held it for a year or 2. I don't know why. Probably because it was a rental. No one lived there. I don't believe there were any owner occupants there until this very last transfer in 2017. To Eric and Annabella, who are not living there right now, but are in the midst of refurbishing it, and they will plan to be moving here to Warren, I guess within the next year or so. It's an interesting story. I met Annabella. She's a very interesting person, a Venezuelan national, but of Portuguese descent. But what's interesting is her grandparents emigrated from Portugal to Warren, Rhode Island in the 50s and worked at the mill for 20 years. When it was Samsonite. They worked in this, it was a Samsonite building at that point. But so she feels a kinship and sort of a homey relationship with Warren. And she's also actually a well-known ceramic artist. And so, yeah, so I'm sure she's very interested in becoming part of this group, in fact, too. So I'm sure you'll be hearing more about her.
Perfect fit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, absolutely perfect fit for Warren. Now, 212 Market Street. This is an interesting house because it's probably one of the most common styles built in Warren. Although this is actually a pioneer in its neighborhood. It was the first house in its neighborhood, and it's still the oldest house in its neighborhood. This is a style of house that was built all the way from around 1840-ish all the way until 1910. And the only way you can tell them apart by looking at them is by the trim and maybe like the kind of nails they used in the house, but they almost did not change the style at all for 70 years or so. It's really kind of interesting. I lived in a house in Providence that was very much like this, except with a different orientation. It was built in 1888, but really it had the same detail trim, the same kind of porch and everything. But this house we can pin down pretty closely because of the fact that the land it was built on was uninhabited. It was known to be uninhabited. It was at some time probably part of the Indian campsite. It was marshland for the most part. And in 1854, it was first subdivided as Handy's Plat, 47 lots. You go to the next. This shows the plan of Handy's Plat, 47 lots. This is Market Street. Child Street. The lots in question are right here. And as you see here, there's a non-existent paper street that was put in for platting purposes. And the idea being that these front lots were suitable for house construction, but that the back lots, because they were so close to sea level, were considered dangerously marshy. And were probably reserved, this is lost slightly, but I assume that they were reserved for agricultural or storage or just view purposes. It took a while for these lots to sell, and I think that's because these lots were going to be abandoned. So what happened is, by the 1860s, all these lots in the back were folded into the front lot, the house lot. And then they were sold that way. The paper street was just never built. The original owners of this house, basically bought these two lots separately, and this lot here, lot 35 of the handy plat, which is now lot 73 of the current plat. At that point, the lot 38 of the handy plat was already part of this lot. So basically, there were four lots of the original, which are now lot 73, which goes all the way back here, and lot 90. I don't know why they're not in order. That goes all the way back to here. So the brief history. Oh, the next slide. There's a little bit of a larger picture and a little blur here of the same lot. And so what you see here is this is the side lot, lot 90, and then this is the house. The house is right here on this lot, and this back lot was included with this lot in the sale of 1873. So the lots could change hands a couple times through speculators, but finally in 1866 the lots were combined, and in 1873 John Usher, who had put the lots together, sold to Thomas Sinister the three lots, 36, 30, 35, 36, and 37 of Handy's plat. And that is, within a year of that is when the house was built. So I feel comfortable with the date of 1873. Could have been 1874, possibly. That part is probably impossible to tell exactly. In 1887, the Thomas Sinister estate sold to John and Nancy Sinister, and it remained with the Sinisters through probate, transferred through probate, until 1970, when the last descendant of the Sinisters sold the house in September 1971 to Benjamin and Thelma to Myron and Alice Reynolds. And then basically, we sold to the current owners, Robert Smith and Janet Johnson. So this was in the Sinister family since 1873 all the way until 1970s. So 100 years in the family. This is, if you look at this on say, even a map as late as 1895, sorry, you'll see that this was even then the only house in the entire area. And all the houses around Ashland and all that whole neighborhood on the other side of the street, those were all built between about 1898 and 1905. That was when that area was platted. So those are all actually newer houses than some people think. I was under the impression myself until I did this actual research that those were from the 1880s or 90s, some of the older houses. But no, the oldest house in that group would be about 1900.